Now that 4 lines of the white color have been woven on top, the black color will be lifted and woven on top with the white color woven on the bottom. First, lift every other piece of black warp on top of the ruler to weave another black line of weft on the top layer of the weaving. To weave the white layer or color 2 on the bottom, the entire warp of the black color or color 1 must be lifted and every other piece of paper of the white warp or color 2. Insert the weft of the white paper. Repeat this process again, weaving one more line with the black color or color 1 on top. Now the pickup double weave portion of this sample begins. Begin by picking up part of the bottom layer or white color before weaving the top layer or black color. For this sample, lift up 4 pieces of the warp in the center of the bottom layer or white color for this example. There will be 3 pieces of the white warp left down. Place the ruler under all 4 pieces of warp. 2 rulers will be needed to proceed with the weaving. One to keep the pickup portion lifted, the other to continue the weaving pattern. Use the second ruler to lift up every other thread of the white warp and the entire black warp that surrounds the white area that is picked up. The black warp under the area that is picked up can be left down. Continue the weave pattern of the white warp in the picked up area. This allows the white layer of the woven area to come on top of the black layer. Remove the ruler from the picked up portion of the white warp. Only one ruler needs to remain to insert the white weft. Now it is clear to see the black or top layer of the weaving is lifted on either side of the portion of the white area or the second layer of the weaving that has been lifted. The weave structure or weave pattern continues in the lifted area. There are only 2 pieces of the white warp on top of the ruler. Insert the white weft into the weaving. Before weaving the black layer or color 1, lift the entire area of the white layer or color 2 that was just woven on top. This will keep the color on the top layer while weaving the next layer. Lift every other thread of the black layer and continue keeping the white layer or the second layer lifted in the area that it was lifted on the first ruler. Remove the ruler and shift the second ruler all the way to the top. It is clear to see now that lifted area remains on top of the ruler and the pattern weaving the black layer or color 1 continues over, under, over, under, over, under. This will allow the entire black layer or color 1 to be woven with the white layer or the picked up layer woven on top. Insert the weft and shift to the top of the weaving. Now the black layer or color 1 will be lifted in the negative space before weaving the white layer. Lift all the black warp surrounding the lifted white area on one ruler. After the black warp or color 1 is lifted in the areas that the white warp or color 2 will be woven on the bottom layer, use a ruler to lift up the white warp every other piece of paper, making sure to keep the top layer or black warp on top of the ruler in the areas where it's previously lifted. In the areas where the second layer or the white warp is lifted, leave the black warp or color 1 on the bottom. In this tutorial, the rulers are exchanged because it is easier to work with a narrower ruler as the weaving goes down the warp. This is a good time to check to see that the entire black warp is lifted on either side of the area where the white weft will be woven. Insert the white weft and shift to the top. Before weaving the next line or the black piece of weft, lift up the areas of the white warp that were just woven and need to remain on top of the weaving. Then pick up every other piece of warp of the black paper or color 1, making sure to continue lifting up the white warp in the area that it is picked up. When all the warp has been lifted, insert another piece of black weft. After the black layer is woven or color 1 is woven, the negative space of color 1 must be lifted. Lift up the black layer or color 1 surrounding the white area that is woven on top. For this layer, the pattern will begin shifting. Lift one less piece of warp to the right side of the lifted area of the white or second layer of woven warp. This will allow the pattern or shape of the second layer that is picked up to expand or change shapes. Then pick up every other warp thread of the bottom layer or color 2. Making sure to keep the warp on top of the areas that are lifted and leave the warp down in the areas that are not lifted with the pickup stick. Then insert the white weft or color 2, pushing it to the top. Next, lift up color 2 or the white area that was just woven. Then lift up every other thread of color 1 or the black layer, leaving the white layer or color 2 on top. It is a good rule of thumb to remember to lift up the color that was just woven, then weave the opposite color. In this instance, the white color or color 2 is lifted, then the black color or color 1 will be woven. The next step will be to lift up color 1 or the black area on either side of the white woven picked up area. Next, pick up 2 pieces of the black warp on the right side, moving to the left side. Then 4 pieces of the black warp or color 1 on the left side of the picked up pattern. In this instance, 1 extra piece of warp is left down for the picked up pattern to begin shifting again. Then lift up every other piece of the warp of color 2, then insert the weft for color 2. Shift to the top. Next, pick up the warp of color 2 that was just woven. Then lift up every other piece of color 1 warp or the black warp, keeping the picked up area on top of the weaving. Insert the weft for color 1 or the black weft. Next, pick up color 1 on the outsides of the picked up area of color 2. This time picking up only 1 piece of the warp on the right side of color 2 and 4 on the left side of color 2. This will allow the pattern to continue to shift. Then pick up every other piece of color 2 and weave in the weft of color 2. Now that color 2 is woven, pick up the area of color 2 that was lifted and woven on top of the weaving. After the entire area of color 2 is lifted, pick up every other piece of warp of color 1, making sure to keep the warp underneath the area of color 2 that has been lifted and on the top of color 2 in the areas where it has not been lifted. It is important to remember to use an alternating pickup pattern of the weave structure from the previous line of woven. Next, color 1 on the outside of the picked up pattern is lifted up as every other piece of color 2 is lifted, making sure to keep color 2 on top of the area where it is lifted and underneath color 1 in the areas where color 1 should be on top. It is a good time to check the weave structure and make sure all of the warp and weft are in line, creating a grid. As this process continues, it is easy for the warp and the weft to become loose and shift out of the grid structure. In this particular line, everything is picked up in one pass instead of picking up with one stick, then picking up with another stick and shifting all the warp to one stick. It can be done either way. Next, when picking up color 2, or the white area that was woven on top, the picked up area is shifted to the left by one piece of warp. Then the paper, or the warp color 1, is picked up underneath that lifted area of color 2. Not picking up the entire area of color 2 that was woven allows the shape of color 2 that is lifted on top of the weaving to change shape. As the warp gets shorter, one stick is used to pick up both layers, this time picking up all of color 1 and then every other piece of color 2, making sure to leave color 1 down in the areas where the color 2 is lifted or woven on top, and then lifting color 1 up above color 2, alternating every other piece of color 2, with color 1 all lifting on top. Then insert color 2 into the weft. Next, every other piece of warp of color 1, or the black warp, is lifted, and color 2 is lifted on top of the same ruler in the area where the pattern of color 2 is picked up into the weaving. Next, every other piece of warp of color 2 is lifted, and the entire warp of color 1 is lifted on either side of the picked up pattern of color 2. In this instance, 3 pieces of color 1 are lifted up on the right side of the lifted pattern, and 4 pieces of color 1 are lifted up on the left side of the pattern, with color 2 being lifted up consistently across every other piece of warp. Then color 2 weft is inserted into the weaving. Now color 1 is woven all the way across the weaving, lifting up only every other piece of color 1, leaving color 2 down the entire way across. Next, color 2 is woven all the way across, lifting up the entire warp of color 1 and every other piece of color 2. 3 more rows are woven. First, color 1 on top, lifting every other piece of warp, then lifting the entire warp of color 1 and weaving every other piece of warp of color 2, then again color 1 on top, lifting every other piece of warp.